For a time, the Buried Alive match felt like one of the darkest ideas World Wrestling Entertainment ever turned into a recurring attraction. It was not just violent, it was morbid. The objective was simple and unforgettable. Throw your opponent into an open grave and bury him under enough dirt to end the match. Few stipulations sounded more severe, and few carried such an immediate sense of dread. Even by the company's standards, this was not an ordinary gimmick. It felt like a ritual, a punishment, and a horror scene all at once. That is exactly why the match stood out. The Buried Alive match was never built to feel athletic in the usual sense. It was built to feel ominous. The image of a grave sitting beside the entranceway did most of the work before the match even started. The audience already knew this was not going to be a normal contest. It was designed to turn a wrestling feud into something grim and theatrical, where the finish looked less like a victory and more like an attempted erasure. And that is the key to understanding why the stipulation worked at all. The Buried Alive match was not meant for just anyone. It was a concept almost inseparable from The Undertaker, whose entire character was built around death, darkness, cemeteries, and supernatural menace. World Wrestling Entertainment's own historical material treats the stipulation as one of the company's rarest and most macabre matches, and that makes perfect sense. This was not a format that could be dropped into any rivalry. It depended on the right atmosphere, the right character, and the right story. Without that, it would have felt absurd instead of intimidating. For a while though, the company made it work. The first Buried Alive match between The Undertaker and Mankind in 1996 immediately gave the concept a place in the company's darker mythology. From there, the stipulation became one of those rare attractions that returned only when a feud felt intense enough and the imagery felt appropriate. According to the company's own retrospective, there have only been 5 Buried Alive matches in its history. That number says everything. This was never a standard specialty match. It was a carefully rationed spectacle. Its rarity was part of its power. Because the company did not overuse it, the Buried Alive match kept its aura. It felt dangerous, strange, and a little unhinged every time it returned. That is difficult for most gimmick matches to maintain. The more often a stipulation appears, the more ordinary it becomes. But a Buried Alive match could still feel like an event because it was so closely tied to a specific mood and a specific type of storytelling. At the same time, that was also its biggest limitation. A match built around burying someone in a grave is almost impossible to make into a regular feature. It is too character-specific, too visually extreme, and too dependent on elaborate staging. It does not naturally fit a wide range of rivalries. It also risks becoming unintentionally ridiculous if the performers, the feud, or the presentation are not exactly right. A Hell in a Cell match can be adapted to many stories. A Buried Alive match cannot. It belongs to a much narrower creative lane. That helps explain why it became so rare. The stipulation was memorable, but it was never broadly useful. It worked best when the company wanted to present a feud as something darker than ordinary competition, and even then, it was still tied heavily to The Undertaker's world. In fact, one of the clearest patterns in the match's history is that it remains centered around him. That kind of dependence gives a stipulated identity, but it also limits its lifespan. When a match is tied that closely to one character, it becomes harder to justify once that character is no longer central to the product in the same way. There was also a broader change in company presentation over time. In 2008, World Wrestling Entertainment publicly announced that its programming had moved to a PG television rating and described its product as family programming meant to engage viewers across generations. That shift does not erase darker storytelling altogether. But it does matter when discussing a match whose entire image revolves around graves, dirt, and symbolic burial. A company that is steering itself toward a more controlled and broadly marketable image is naturally going to have less room for one of its most openly macabre creations. So why is the Buried Alive match remembered so strongly if it was used so rarely? Because it gave the company something few stipulations can give: instant atmosphere. The grave itself told the story. The audience did not need long explanations. One look at the set was enough to understand that the feud had entered a different category. That visual identity made the match unforgettable, even if it was never meant to become a staple. And that is the real story of the Buried Alive match. It was one of World Wrestling Entertainment's darkest gimmicks because it was designed to feel like more than a match. It was a piece of Gothic theatre built into a wrestling show, and for the right performer, in the right rivalry, it was incredibly effective. But it was also too specialized, too theatrical, and too dependent on a very specific kind of character work to survive as a regular attraction. In the end, the Buried Alive match did not fade away for lack of impact. It became rare because it was never built for normal use in the first place. It was a spectacle reserved for moments when the company wanted wrestling to feel less like a sport and more like a nightmare. That is why it remains memorable, and that is why it still stands as one of the darkest gimmicks World Wrestling Entertainment ever created.